Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a dark but absolutely crucial piece of American history. We're looking at the Ku Klux Klan, unpacking the 150-year history of America's oldest hate group. To really grasp the long struggle for civil rights in the U.S., we've got to understand what this organization actually was and what it is today.
We're going to break this complex history down into their origins, the three distinct historical waves of the group, and finish up with exactly where they stand in the modern day.
You know, the biggest misconception about the Klan is that it's been one long, unbroken chain since the beginning. It really hasn't. The group actually died out and resurrected across three very specific eras: 1865, 1915, and the 1950s. They constantly morphed their specific brand of hate to prey on whatever cultural anxieties were gripping the country at that particular time.
Section 1. Origins and Ideology. Let's start with the name itself. The term Ku Klux actually comes from the Greek word kuklos, which basically means a circle or a band of brothers. Back in December 1865, right after the Civil War, 6 Confederate veterans in Pulaski, Tennessee founded the group and tried to frame it as just a fraternal social club. They tacked on Klan just for the alliteration. But as you can imagine, this so-called social club morphed into a violent vigilante group almost immediately.
To build up a false sense of secrecy and mystique, the Klan created a wildly complex hierarchy with these outlandish, almost cartoonish titles. You had a Grand Wizard at the very top. Their first was former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Then you've got Grand Dragons managing entire regions, an exalted Cyclops running a local chapter called a Clavern, and a Clud acting as their chaplain. I mean, it sounds like a bad fantasy novel, right? But this crazy internal language was entirely by design. It fostered deep group loyalty and projected an incredibly intimidating, mysterious vibe to anyone on the outside.
Section 2. The first wave during the Reconstruction Era. Popping up right after the Civil War, this original iteration of the Klan essentially functioned as a domestic terror insurgency. Look at the context here. Formerly enslaved African Americans were finally gaining basic civil and political rights. While the first wave's entire goal was to maintain absolute white supremacy and crush the Republican Party, which, remember, was the political party pushing for those new rights back then. They did this by violently suppressing newly freed Black Americans to stop them from voting, holding office, or integrating into society.
And their tactics for this political terrorism were just horrifying. They launched nighttime raids on horseback to ambush people in the dark. This is also when they started wearing those ghostly white robes and pointed hoods. Now, some historians think they were trying to pose as the literal ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers to scare people. But honestly, it served the very practical, cowardly purpose of hiding their faces while they committed massive voter intimidation, brutal beatings, and deadly lynchings all across the South.
But here's the thing. This first wave actually didn't last that long. Why? Because the federal government aggressively stepped in. In 1870 and 1871, Congress passed the Ku Klux Klan Acts. These laws made violating someone's voting rights a federal crime, and they gave President Ulysses S. Grant the power to deploy the military and suspend habeas corpus to crush the Klan's rebellion. And it totally worked. By the end of the 1870s, the first Klan was pretty much wiped out.
Section 3. The second wave and their national resurgence in the 1920s.
Flash forward to November 1915 atop Stone Mountain, Georgia. A preacher named William Joseph Simmons kicks off a massive revival. But the craziest part about this is what sparked it. They were heavily inspired by a blockbuster Hollywood movie called The Birth of a Nation. It was a violently racist film that completely glorified that original 1860s Klan, pushing a totally distorted lost cause narrative of the Civil War. It was a massive hit at the box office and acted as the ultimate propaganda tool to get a whole new generation to put on the robes. But notice how their targets dramatically shifted in this new era. The first wave was mostly focused on African Americans and their political allies down south. But the 1920s Klan, they leaned hard into xenophobia to widen their net. They started aggressively targeting Jewish people, Catholics, and immigrants, alongside Black Americans. By packaging their hate under the guise of 100% Americanism and pitching themselves as defenders of traditional moral values, their appeal absolutely skyrocketed across the Midwest and northern states. Okay, here is a wild historical fact that almost always gets misunderstood. The Burning Cross, that infamous, terrifying ritual, was not a Reconstruction-era tactic. There is literally zero documentation of the 1860s Klan burning crosses. They actually adopted it in 1915, purely as a psychological weapon, and they got the idea straight out of that movie, The Birth of a Nation. They tried to spin it as a religious symbol representing the light of Christ, but let's be real. It was a horrifying spectacle designed entirely to intimidate people and draw huge, curious crowds to their rallies. Fueled by this wider net of hatred and some incredibly organized marketing, the Klan's numbers exploded. By the mid-1920s, they hit an estimated peak of 4 million members. Think about that, 4 million. We're talking massive marches straight down Pennsylvania Avenue in D.C. They held serious political power, with members sitting in Congress and in governors' mansions. Ultimately, though, a wave of major financial and sex scandals, plus some relentless newspaper exposés, completely shattered their moral facade. Membership tanked, and they formally dissolved again in 1944 after the IRS hit them with a bill for over $500,000 in back taxes.
Which brings us to Section 4, the third wave during the Civil Rights Era.
This third iteration was much more fragmented, and it popped up primarily to violently push back against the growing civil rights movement. The main catalyst? The 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, which ordered the desegregation of public schools. White supremacists instantly mobilized a massive resistance campaign. Decentralized, totally independent Klan groups sprang up all over the South with one goal: terrorize civil rights workers and violently oppose any attempts at school integration or voter registration drives.
Because they were a loose network of localized groups instead of one giant entity like in the 20s, their tactics became incredibly clinical and deadly. They relied heavily on brutal murders and bombings. The most infamous and truly heartbreaking attack was the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. That blast killed 4 young African-American girls who were just getting ready for Sunday service. They also murdered multiple civil rights workers who were just trying to help black citizens register to vote. It was a profoundly dark era of localized domestic terrorism.
Finally, Section 5, the Klan today, their decline and fragmentation.
Eventually, intense FBI infiltration, tough criminal prosecutions, and some absolutely crippling civil lawsuits from groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center broke the backs of these organizations. They essentially bankrupted them. Remember that staggering 4 million number from the 1920s? Well, to put things into perspective, today estimates suggest there are only about 5,000 to 8,000 Klan members left nationwide. Obviously, any number of hate group members is too many, but that is an undeniable, massive decline in their strength over the last century.
And today, they are absolutely not a unified national force anymore. Right now, they're just a severely diminished, constantly infighting network of isolated splinter groups. You've got factions like the American Patriot Knights in Tennessee focusing on local anti-immigration recruitment, the Maryland White Knights doing most of their recruiting in sketchy online forums, and the Silent Knights dropping anti-Semitic flyers across a few states. They're constantly feuding with each other, splitting up, and frantically trying to rebrand just to stay relevant in modern extremist circles.
This quote from Mark Pitcavage at the Anti-Defamation League really hits the nail on the head. He says, "Far from being resurgent, the history of the Ku Klux Klan in recent decades has been one of periods of stagnation, alternating with periods of decline. So, despite the occasional sensational headline or their attempts to piggyback on modern political tensions, they are fundamentally an eroding, stagnant force. They're basically just clinging to the lingering, ugly mythology of their own name."
So we'll leave you with this question to chew on. If history shows us that this group can literally resurrect itself and adapt its specific brand of hatred during times of cultural anxiety, like we saw in 1865, then 1915, and again in the 1950s, what exactly do we need to do today to make sure they stay a relic of the past for good? Thanks for tuning into this explainer. Facing the hard facts of our history is the absolute best way to understand the present and make sure we don't repeat it.